Matthew, everyday audiophile, music lover, beer enthusiast. Now, I know there's some people that are unhappy with me opening a beer at the beginning of the video, and I'm sorry, it's just the way it is. Beer is a part of my life. It's a part of my music journey, and I'm not quite what to say about this with this color. This is the Prairie Buzzer Beater. It's a sour, and it's probably going to have to wait until the end of the video. That's an interesting one. So, if you couldn't tell already, today's video is about these two network streamers. They have been in my system in different systems, if you saw my last video, at different points in time over the last month and a half. And it's really given me a chance to evaluate what they sound like, what their strengths are, and what I don't like about each of them. But before we go into the sound quality, let's talk about the exterior, the price, and just overall build quality. From a spec standpoint, they're both pretty much the same. I'm going to pick up the Holo Red here. They both have an AES output, two coaxial outputs, one BNC, one RCA, one USB, and one optical. The only thing that the Lumin gains over the Holo Audio is a second USB port, while the Holo sports an I2S output. We're going to be talking about that for sure. Besides that, obviously the Lumin has their signature display in the front, while the Holo here just has a little light that tells you the status of the unit. Starts blinking yellow and red and green as it's booting up, but otherwise it's silent and it's nice. When you pick up the Holo Red, it is a very hefty unit. It is way heavier than it looks like, and it feels great in the hands, especially for the asking price of $800. Every time I pick this up and I have to move it, I'm just surprised. The Lumin, on the other hand, it feels cheap by comparison. This is just bent aluminum here, and while it does look nice on your rack, picking it up doesn't exactly give you that confidence of it being a well-constructed unit. That's just my opinion on it, but that is what it is. You feel like for the money, which, by the way, this is $800 compared to, I believe, $2,800, so $2,000 less. This feels like a more substantial unit, in my opinion. So, even though I'm comparing them as if they're equals, they may be in features, but they're not in price. The Holo is definitely the cheaper of the two. On the software side, there are a lot of similarities. I'll start with the Lumin. The Lumin has its own dedicated app, but it does support Spotify Connect, Qobuz Connect, Tidal Connect, and Roon. On the Holo Audio side, there is no app, but you do get the same Spotify, Tidal, Qobuz, as well as UPnP, which is the foundation that Lumin uses for its Lumin app. So, aside from having a dedicated app, you could open the same UPnP controller, which if you're on iOS, it's, JPlay is the usual recommendation, and control both of these. The only other thing to note is that the Holo is based on a Raspberry Pi, and while that may give you some pause as to the overall sound quality when you compare it against other Raspberry Pi streamers, Holo Audio's done a really good job of making sure all of the inputs and outputs are on its own board, separated from the main Raspberry Pi. It's really a nice design when you look at it. Lumin, on the other hand, uses their own proprietary chip, and the circuit board is very nicely laid out. Before we kick it off, let's talk about the system, the main system that I use to evaluate these. On the streamer side, obviously we have these two. I set them up in a variety of configurations, and I'll talk about that while I'm talking about the sound. But for the most part, these were both hooked into my Audio S5B, with that feeding via RCA into the Audio A21 integrated. Now, I would be using the EL84 monoblocks, but as the solid state amp is just a little bit more detailed, a little bit more resolving than tubes, it made it a lot easier to evaluate these two. On the speaker side, I am using the Pure Art Fi LS6s. These are a beautiful speaker that uses the Purify midwoofers with a nice AMT tweeter. I'll definitely be talking about them at some point. They are something special, that's for sure. But okay, let's talk about how they sounded. At first, what I did was just hook up USB to each, listen to 30 seconds on one, and then stop the song, switch to USB on the other one, and then 30 seconds from there. I had to do this a number of times because, as you can imagine, since it's not instant, you can't use a longer track or a continuous track and switch between the two inputs, since my DAC only has one USB input. So the notes here had to be very detailed between the two. But you'll be happy to know that as far as playback through Roon, I couldn't really tell the difference between the two. And that's a good thing for the Holo Red and not as good of a thing for the Lumin. They both had the same characteristics that I was looking for from the music, and this is the same across soundstage width and depth and height, as well as that frequency response. Neither one was more punchy than the other. Really, even sighted, I could not tell a difference between the two. I'm just going to say it as it is. USB, Roon, it's all the same. I even tried different DACs. For a while I had these both hooked up to the Live Harmony DAC, which in my experience has been a little bit more sensitive to USB noise or USB cable length, any of that. And still, I could not tell a difference between the two. Now, there's a lot of ways to interpret that, but for me, for the time being, what that just means is that they're both great. There's no upside or downside between one or the other. Your mileage may vary, of course, but this has just been my experience over the last month. Where things got different, though, was with I2S. So not only was I able to compare USB on the Lumin to I2S on the Holo Red, but also plugging both USB and I2S from the Red into the streamer at the same time. And as you can imagine, since the USB sounded the same between the two, the results were the same. And very, very nuanced. I'll say that when it came to vocals and mids and highs and the airiness in any of the tracks that I played, I also could not tell the difference between I2S and USB. Now, that kind of goes against what I've read on the interwebs, with a lot of people claiming that I2S is superior, but with the Audio S5B, that simply wasn't the case. And even with the Live Harmony DAC, while I2S was better, as it was in the audio, and I'll talk about in a sec, it wasn't enough of a difference that I would say one is always superior to the other. I wouldn't be able to hear USB and then come back an hour later and listen to I2S and be like, wow, that is just mind-blowingly better every single time. This is one where you have to switch inputs on the DAC back and forth and back and forth. And on some tracks, especially if it's acoustic, something that's just in a live and open space, I couldn't tell the difference. USB and I2S, the exact same. Where the differences started to show, and again, these are very small differences that I'm not sure I could pick up if I listened to this an hour later or 2 hours later, was in the bass response. There was just a smidgen less bass with USB, and with I2S, that really came in the form of a little bit more bass slam. It was just as detailed and just as sharp on the corners. When a note ended, the bass ended just as it's supposed to, But on that attack, there was just a little bit more on I2S. Again, not enough to really sway me one way or the other, but I will say that throughout my testing, I did end up on I2S more often than USB. So maybe there's more to it that I just am not picking up immediately. But by and large, if you are considering the HoloRed purely for I2S, me personally, it didn't make a huge difference, but it's nice that it's there. And before anyone goes and asks what HDMI cable I'm using for I2S, it is this. It is a foot long, so it is about as short as you can have with an HDMI cable, and it sounds great. I have tried a longer HDMI cable, a 1 meter, so about 3 feet, and I could tell a difference between that and the 1 foot. So definitely, if you're going I2S, my recommendation is to get as short of an HDMI cable as you can. I haven't tried any of the audiophile HDMI cables from the likes of Nordost or any of the other big manufacturers. I really just was interested in getting the shortest length possible, and to be honest, from most of those manufacturers, the shortest that you can get is 0.8 meters to 3/4 meters. And it's been my experience that a shorter HDMI cable is superior to a longer one with better materials. Now, it'd be interesting if I could get a short HDMI cable like this from Nordost. I would totally give it a shot and let you know those results, but for the time being, this is what I'm using. So, is it all bad news for the Lumin? No. In my last video, I did mention that I liked the Lumin slightly more than the HoloRed, and I didn't give any context as to why. It comes down to the UPnP implementation between the two. With both of these supporting UPnP, you can, in Roon, start playing a song and then go to your favorite UPnP app and play the same song, and it'll just take over and start streaming from that instead. So it makes it very easy to switch between streaming modes and try to hear a difference. I will admit with some sadness that while I was under the belief that Roon was as good as it got, I was proven wrong. UPnP is superior, even if only slightly. UPnP is a standard, so it should be implemented the same across all devices, but my hearing test proved that that wasn't the case. Roon and UPnP through the HoloRed sounded the same to me. There was no difference. On the Lumin, on the other hand, the attacks on all notes were just a little bit more intense. There was a little bit more detail in the voices of female singers, especially when I look at like Chantel Chamberlain. There's a warble in her voice in some of her tracks that comes through on Roon, but through UPnP, it sounds like she's actually there. You're listening inside of her throat, as a friend would put it. And so it's for that reason that I feel like the Lumin streamer wasn't really meant to be used with Roon. If you're going to get it and you already aren't a fan of Roon, then you're upgrading the sound in comparison to the Holo. That's where this contextual it's better comes from. It is better, but only when you use UPnP. If you're using Roon, they both sound the same to me, with the HoloRed sounding a little bit better through I2S. Again, this is such a small difference between all three of these that it's not going to stop me from using Roon. I will still use Roon for my critical listening because the difference that I was hearing with UPnP wasn't enough to ruin my enjoyment of music and all of the benefits that I get from Roon, right? I am able to go and search for new music and find artists that are similar to what I'm listening to, and all of that and enjoying the music is far more important to me than hearing just a little bit more detail. I'm not a detail freak. I just want to sit back and enjoy the music and have a drink while I'm at it. But until then, I hope y'all have a great week, and I will see you next time. See ya.